Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the Complexities of Inland Response, where you'll hear from our core group. Thank you for joining us. This session is going to be recorded and be available on our website in the technical library. If you have any questions for our presenters throughout the presentation, please pop them into the chat function, and one of the team will get to them at the end of the presentation. And with that, I'll hand you over now to Marcus Russell.
There we go. Thanks, Mandy. Good afternoon, everyone. Or good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, wherever you may be. My name's Marcus Russell, and I'm the Discipline Mentor for the Inland Core Group. Before we start, it's probably just giving a little bit of explanation of the purpose of OSRAIL's Core Group programme, of which there are 9 different disciplines. But the main purpose for us is to enhance the in-house capability and ultimately better serve the needs of our members. So we're fortunate in the Inland Core Group that all of the members come with from a wide range of backgrounds, from working with local authorities, NGOs, enforcement agencies and commercial consultancies, as well as international oil and gas. And that gives them a very broad experience and good all-round depth in inland matters. So through the course of this presentation, or over the next 20-30 minutes, we'll be hearing from Nick, Adriana, Richard and Tom. So just if you want to see what they're like, I forgot to advance my slides. There we go. So it would be Nick Dyer, who's the chair, Adriana, hands up, Richard Tyndall, Tom Fisher and myself. Just to set a little bit of the scene, give a little bit of background, but one of the common statements that we often hear when we arrive on inland spills or from our members is that I didn't realise oil spill response responded to inland incidents as well. The reasons for that are quite understandable, but when you actually look at the reality of the incidents that we do support, there's quite a significant proportion of those relate to onshore operations. Just a sample on the slide there. What you can see is, as a Tier 3 organisation, what it means is we have to be prepared to respond to incidents from upstream, midstream and downstream scenarios. That can be in any number of different environmental conditions. It can also be the range of oil types. So it can be your lights and your heavies, or your crudes or refined products. So we have to be prepared to be able to respond to the full gambit. What we're using today is really a combination of the group's experience and insight of working for oil spill response. So a combination of those two factors of working for a Tier 3 organisation and the experience that the guys have brought from their previous roles. And what we've managed to do is draw on a few of the different common threads that seem to differentiate inland issues from those of marine, and there are probably 3 key areas. So we've kind of plumped it on legislation, preparedness and response issues, and looking at maybe why inland may be a little bit more complex than first thought. So without further ado, what I will do is I will hand you over to Richard Tyndall. Richard, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marcus. Could you just forward on the slide, please? Okay, so good day, everyone. I'm going to try and keep this as short as possible and nice and easy, as I know this is a subject that we all love, legislation and conventions. So, when we look at oil spill response in the term of preparedness, you simply have to love a convention, especially when looking at it from a marine context, for example, APRC 90 or MARPOL 7378. They generally prescribe to the ratifying country what is needed in terms of preparedness, and this is done throughout its articles and or its regulations. Guidance is then often written off the back of the convention to assist governments, operators and agencies to fulfil the obligation of the specific convention, which enables an easier transition for national law and implementation. However, when we look at inland oil spill response in terms of preparedness, there are no such international conventions prescribing the same detail as for that of marine. Can we move on, please, Marcus? So why is this? Beyond a country's exclusive economic zone is what seas and oceans are referred to as international resources. These are resources which belong to all countries of the world. Although oceans are technically viewed as international zones, meaning that not one country has jurisdiction over it, there are international regulations in place. These regulations, through conventions, are prescribed by the International Maritime Organization. These regulations also transcend into a country's EEZ and territorial and coastal waters through national law if the country ratifies the specific convention and the convention has come into force. A major oil spill to the marine environment often has a higher degree of global interest to that of an inland oil spill. This is because marine spills can and will almost probably affect many different countries and cross many international borders. Of course, this is dependent on the location of the oil spill and the environmentals at that time. Basically, oil spills to the marine environment can have a greater impact internationally as well as on a domestic level. Next slide, please, Marcus. So inland spills occur every day across most nations. However, there is no international convention to prescribe how to be prepared for such an event. An inland spill is usually modest, only occasionally becoming public news if it causes closure of major transport routes or if a polluter is taken to court. But an inland spill can be more persistent than a marine spill due to the nature of the affected resources and socio-economic impact it could have. In the United Kingdom, and as for most countries of the world, inland oil spills are not regulated like that of marine oil spill. The principle is the same in the fact that the polluter must pay, but with inland spills, it is not always an easy job to find that polluter unless it happens to be a major blue chip oil company. Country by country have their own regime of environmental legislation for pollution prevention and control, but not for the utilisation of OSROs. As an example, the responsibility of the UK environmental regulators is to protect and improve the environment. They investigate causes of pollution and aim to find those responsible. If, as an operator, you have a spill, on site or during transportation, you are responsible for its cleanup and restoration of the environment. If, as an operator, you do not take responsibility, the environmental regulators can arrange for the work that is needed and then recharge you as the polluter. But in the UK, there is no legislation for the environment agencies to set standards for oil spill response, as the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency can do with the IMO OPRC 90 and other conventions which are embedded into UK law. Because of this lack of legislation, only good practices can be devised to ensure that if there is an incident, the operator can be prepared for such an event. Next slide, please, Marcus. So what does good practice mean? IPCA and IOGP define good practice as a statement of internationally recognised guidelines, practices and procedures that will enable the delivery of acceptable health, safety and environmental performance. They also say that this will change over time in light of advances of technology, practical experience and scientific understanding, as well as changes in political and social environment. But it should be remembered that good practice is not legislation, it is not regulation, and it is not legally binding. Having read through vast amounts of documentation to facilitate literature reviews, it is apparent that OSROs for operators within the inland environment are not included. There is no specific inland oil spill response legislation or regulation. Regulations and legislation do mention that emergency preparedness plans should be in place and that these should be written in consultation with local authorities, agencies and the National Emergency Services, but there is no mention of OSROs. There is also mention of training for incidents, evacuation plans, firefighting, removal of substances, but again, no mention of OSROs or timeframes for response. When responders are mentioned within UK legislation for pollution events and their control, legislation states that there are two categories of responder. A Category 1 responder, which includes the emergency services, the police, the fire service, the ambulance service, local authorities, health bodies such as the NHS and acute services, and government agencies like the Environment Agency and the Scottish Environment Protection Agency, etc. And it also states that there's a Category 2 responder who are in charge of Food Standards Agency, Water and Sewerage, General Utilities, and the Health and Safety Executive. But again, there was no mention of OSROs. Next slide, please, Marcus. So in summary, some key takeaways for you. If you were developing any type of inland legislation, regulation for inland spill response and or inland oil activity or operations, OPRC 90 as a baseline framework is a great document to work from. As an operator, identify and communicate with all stakeholders within the country of operation to understand the complexity of any national legislation or regulation. Identify all environmental pollution prevention and control legislation. Cross-reference this legislation against your company-owned protocols, policies, standards for OSROs, etc. Update your company protocols, policies, standards to match legislation if your own company limits are at a lower level to the country you're working in. Maintain your company limits if of a higher standard than that of the country, and never lessen your own company standard. And finally, if you have a contracted OSRO, use them to do this with you. If you haven't, use us. Thanks very much for listening. I'll now pass you back over to Marcus. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Just a reminder, if there's any questions, please pop them into the chat function on the right-hand side of the screen. So, okay, Richard's touched on some of the points there, reference around the best practice or good practice, should I say, which leads us nicely on to Adriana. So, Adriana, the floor's yours.
Thank you, Marcus. And good day or good morning, everybody. I'm going to talk about the good practices that Richard mentioned before. These good practices were originally designed for marine spills, but are now being adopted to inland spills, so the information about their application to inland is not so widespread. The first good practice I'm going to talk about is the Environmental Sensitivity Index, or ESI. These maps have been an integral component of oil spill contingency planning in response since 1979 and were originally conceived for coastal and marine environments. Having an ESI map is an essential part of oil spill contingency activities, and currently the ESI maps have three main components: an environmental sensitivity ranking, biological resources sensitivity to oil, and the human use of the resources. In 1995, NOAA proposed ESI rankings for lacustrine and large river settings, but they don't take into consideration other types of environment, especially land environments that might be polluted by oil spills. So this is the reason why all authors or entities, like the example shown in the right part of the slide, adapted ESI to terrestrial environments. They define terrestrial ESIs by the identification of areas with homogeneous geomorphological characteristics, and they took segments with similar properties and called them landscape units or landform units, and representing them by polygons, unlike the linear segments of coastal environments. For the landscape unit, this example proposes 5 key variables that control the dynamics of the oil in terrestrial environments, all of them with the same importance. These variables are slope, soil texture, soil depth, water table depth, and porosity. Each one assigned a partial sensitivity of high, medium, and low, and the combination of these 5 variables will result in a sensitivity index. So to be consistent with the indexes assigned by NOAA, they are shown here in the bottom of the graphic. The second the next slide. Yeah. The second best practice is the shoreline cleanup assessment technique, or SCAT, which is commonly used to survey the affected area and detect, delineate, and characterize the oil and recommend appropriate response options. The SCAT teams use standard terminology to collect data in oily conditions to support decision making. So there are some challenges to apply this to inland because first, oil can spread in 3 dimensions. For example, in floodplains with high water events where oil coats vegetation as water level drops. The oil can be stranded during low water and can be difficult to map and characterize when water levels rise and flood oil zones. The surveys may be difficult in thick vegetation, so the teams might need local field guides to correctly identify sensitive areas. There are more natural hazards, poisonous snakes, plants, dangerous animals that can be a safety issue. And the surface extent of the oil in groundwater or substrates might be difficult to document. So to apply SCAT to inland, the segments must be polygonous instead of linear. The endpoints need to be more stringent and defined early in the response because of the human use of the resources. Need to document the subsurface oil conditions. There are specific forms different from the ones for coastal environments, specific forms for rivers, stream, and wetlands. We need to include cultural considerations and identify field conditions that can help prioritize the cleanup. For example, areas with high importance for the public. The next good practice is the CIMA, is the spill impact mitigation assessment, which is used to describe the risk-based decisions that are made when considering response options during oil spills. And this CIMA has 4 steps. So when we apply CIMA to inland environments, the main difference is in the first phase of compilation and evaluation of data. So in this step, we of course need inland modeling regarding the fate of the oil. Can be in aquatic environments. We will have several types of soil, the topography, the groundwater, and a variety of climates. In the environmental aspect, variety of fauna, vegetation, we need to consider potable water, exposure pathways. We need also to consider the social aspect, the stakeholders involved, and of course, the potential response options are going to be different from the ones for environmental environment. In the second phase of predict the outcomes, we need to we can use previous spills as background data for no intervention and for the outcome of the feasible response options. For the balance trade-offs, we need specifically to consider that in inland spills tend to take longer to naturally remediate. And for the selection of the best response options, we are going to have a combination of techniques to minimize the ecological, but also the socioeconomic and cultural impacts to promote a rapid recovery. The next best practice is regarding the waste management in inland spills. So the waste management is going to be affected by the type of oil. For example, a high volatile oil can completely evaporate in 1 or 2 days and minimize the amount of waste. The API also has an impact because heavy oils are at risk of sinking once become mixed with suspended sediments. So this will increase the amount of waste, while the low viscosity oils may spread rapidly into thin sheets and will increase the surface area and make the recovery more difficult. So again, that will affect the amount of waste. Regarding the technique, so in situ cleanup will minimize waste. We would prefer also manual recovery over mechanical recovery. In storage, waste aggregation and minimization techniques are very key to ensure an efficient operation. If we don't do segregation and minimization, the waste volumes may spiral out of control. In some remote locations, especially in jungles, the quality of the road infrastructure can be so inadequate that transporting oil waste long distances may be difficult or even impossible. So we need to consider options like on-site incineration. The waste origin, this is important for inland because the material recovered from oil, onshore spills and river environments may contain up to 80% of oil vegetation, and these material, biodegradable material, can be a toxicity hazard once it begins the decomposition. So an example of an extreme case of amount of waste can be the Kalamazoo River spill in Minnesota, where the total volume of waste produced was 136,000 cubic meters, which represented 4,000% of the reported spill volume, which was 3,800 cubic meters. And most of that waste was contaminated soil and sediment and organic matter, and also contaminated water. This is all I had about best practices. Going back to Marcos.
Thanks, Adriana. Really interesting. What we'll do now, we've sort of talked about the good practice. We've touched on SEMA. We're going to move on to one of the other key messages, which is that of tiered preparedness with Tom. So over to you, Tom.
Thank you, Marcus. So as Marcus has just stated, so I'm going to be having a little chat and talk about the tier approach, both to preparedness as well as in response. So just as a reminder of what the tiered approach is. So a tier one, it's made up of 3 tiers. So a tier 1 is it's a smaller little group of people that are capable of dealing with a small spill, or they are there to basically, if there is a bigger spill, they will be the intermediate between the spill happening and a higher up tier coming in to deal with it. Oftentimes in a facility, these are people who have other roles and have just been given some spill response training, so are available as and when that happens. Moving up to tier 2, these are more regional or national. They have more resource and generally more people, and they will share those resources to a tier 1 in an event to supplement what they've already got in place. And then as it moves up, we go to a tier 3, which is international, global resources, more resources generally, and more expertise. And they are there for spills that do require that substantial kind of external input. And this isn't necessarily always due to the amount of products that's spilled. It can be the complexity of where it's spilled, or if it's a particularly sensitive habitat, the consequences that could result of that spill. Next slide, please, Marcus. So when we look at preparedness, it's really important to have considered the tiers that are involved. So an inland spill can often develop really quickly because of where it is. For example, if it's on permeable surface, it can go down through and it can infiltrate, or if it's in a watercourse, then it can very quickly be moved away from the actual spill site. So it's very important to have the awareness of who's going to be called and when they're going to be called within preparedness. This means that you have an awareness of how quickly it's possible to respond, and when all of the, whether you go for tier 2 or tier 3, and whoever comes in, what their role is going to be. And so they are aware of that, that when they come in, they know how to deal with it. The other thing with inland spills, and a good reason for preparedness, is they're often very public, or can be very public. A marine spill is often out of sight and out of mind, whereas an inland spill can be seen by either members of the public or media. So it's important to make sure there is a well-coordinated response. So preparedness is key to that. Next slide, please, Marcus. So going back and having a look at the tiers where they are relevant to inland. So your tier 1, again, if it's a facility, your operator, they're probably going to be people that work for the operator and are aware of how to deal with a spill. So they'll be the first ones that are on the site, and they'll be there to make the initial assessment as to whether they are capable of dealing with it, or whether it needs to be escalated up to a tier 2 to be next. So the tier 2, as I said earlier, will have those additional resources and equipment. And then as we move up, we go to a tier 3, which has the experience advice as well as the additional resources and support. It's often thought that tier 3, as it's an international, it might be too late to bring in a tier 3 once a spill's occurred. But that's not necessarily always the case. There's still a role for a tier 3 24 hours or 48 hours after a spill event. So it's recommended that any time there is a spill, the operator does notify those tier 2 and tier 3 organisations, simply in terms of standing them up. So if they are required, they are there and available and ready to go. Something that's worth noting as well is they're not there to outdo one another. The tiers are there to support. And as you go up through, it depends on that level of support that's required, and it can increase or decrease as the spill goes on. And it's also a bit of a common misconception that the higher tiers mean more people. That's not the case. It could be the tier 1 and tier 2 have the provision of enough people, or even a tier 1 has enough people, but they just require some additional expertise and advice that can come with a tier 3 organisation. Next slide, please, Marcus. So we're just going to have a look at a few case studies and examples where OSRL have been involved and where the tier approach has been used and worked. So this first one was as a result of a natural disaster in the Caribbean. There was a significant amount of oil spilled inland following that natural disaster. The tier 1 operator that was on site was mostly preoccupied with everything else that was going on following that disaster, so they immediately called in tier 2. The tier 2 spiller was from the US, and they began work straight away. And then the tier 3, and in this case, the tier 3 organisation was OSRL, were brought in to fill specialist roles and to add to personnel numbers on the ground and to help coordinate things with the tier 2 organisation that was there. Next slide, please, Marcus. So this one is based in the UK, another case study. This was a train derailment, as you can see from the image on the right-hand side. So this spilled into a location where there were various sensitivities and environmental sensitivities. So it was important that it was dealt with properly, as is every other spill. Due to the location, so it wasn't on a facility or it wasn't near the operator, there was no tier 1 available. So the operator immediately called in tier 2 and a tier 3 organisation simultaneously. So they were there and available and were coordinating the response from the start. The tier 2 provided equipment and the personnel, and the operator brought in OSRL again as a tier 3 organisation just to provide the advice and the coordination of the spill, as well as to liaise with multiple organisations that were on site and use our knowledge and experience to facilitate that role. Next slide, please. And this one is another third and final case study. This is based in the Middle East. There was a subsurface leak of gasoline from a storage tank at a petrol station or forecourt. The tier 1 operator was available and they were on site and were present to begin the initial investigations. And because it wasn't necessarily a specific or required a huge amount of manpower initially, there was no tier 2 brought in due to the size of the spill. They did, however, bring in tier 3, and it was a single individual only for experience, or sorry, their expertise and their advice to coordinate the spill response. So it shows that it doesn't always have to be linear. So a tier 1 doesn't automatically have to then get a tier 2 and then a tier 3. It can be pick and choose between what's needed to suit the specific spill and the specific event. Next slide, please. So just having a little review of what I've just spoken about. So it's worth really recognizing that inland spills do develop very, very quickly. So it's very important to have good preparedness to ensure that we know exactly who is going to be called in when and what their role is going to be during that response. As by doing so, you know, as I said, who, what, and when, and that is the most important thing. It does also mention that all the tiers aren't necessarily required to be involved. So the tier system is there to complement, and each one complements the previous. And if they're not needed, if all of them aren't needed, then there's no point in having them there. And it's also worth noting that not all the tiers specifically have to be on site, especially in the world at the moment. It's possible for things like a tier 3 to be brought in virtually and just be used that way for advice and guidance as to what goes forwards. It's also worth mentioning that a tier 3 organisation doesn't necessarily have to always be a tier 3 organisation. So, for example, for OSRL, if there was a spill local to one of our bases, we can, and as probably many others can as well, can provide a tier 1 or tier 2 type service to basically allow that spill to be remediated as soon as possible. So that's all from me. So back to Marcus.
Thanks, Tom. That's great. Like I say, please feel free to keep the questions coming in the comments column. And what we're going to do now is move on to hear from our core group chair, Nick Dyer. He's going to talk a little bit more about the response side of things and the partnerships that we got. So, Nick, over to you.
Thanks, Marcus. Hello, everybody. Good day. Going to finish up with a couple of slides on partnerships. It's a relatively high level overview. We're going to touch upon various aspects of partnerships, broadly speaking, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats, as we view it from where we're at. Next slide, please, Marcus. I'm going to start with some of the perceived strengths. OSRL comprises of people from diverse backgrounds, which is conducive to problem solving. There's a huge body of evidence. It demonstrates quite compelling case rather that cognitive diversity and differences in how we reason, interpret and solve problems is hugely beneficial to our members. Our advisors hail from many different backgrounds, which includes safety, environmental management, chemistry, marine engineering, incident management, military, domestic emergency services, geology, biology, geomatics, oceanography. I'll go on and on. So you'll appreciate it. A varied assortment of personnel. We are happy or content, comfortable acknowledging what is out with our brief and proactively seek collaboration with partners in industry. This has manifested itself in some existing formal arrangements in the form of an MOU with in-situ remediation specialists, Regenesis, for example, K9 SCAT specialists, Chiron K9, based out in Canada, multiple AUV operators. These are all outsourced areas of expertise. There's ongoing work with respects to the provision of inland modelling services for our members. And the same is true of swift water response to complement the services we already offer. So it's a case of playing to our strengths and delegating where needed. So we are keenly aware of the fact that we have our core services that we need to ring fence, and we mustn't, or none of these endeavours should be allowed to undermine that. This is an evolutionary process, so it's ongoing. So in the words of the man himself, Charles Darwin, those who learn to collaborate and improvise most effectively have prevailed. That is to say that a key part of what we're doing or trying to do is to engage and share knowledge with our members, as well as those that think in a similar fashion. So that may be those are often construed as our competitors. So we certainly exercise with other OSROs, and there are some more formal examples elsewhere. Next slide, please, Marcus. I'll touch upon weaknesses. Clearly, it's important to understand where gaps may exist. And this, in a sense, I'm going to talk around the subject of gap analysis. So In consultation with members in industry, this adds that different perspective or multiple perspectives. With many members represented on our board, this means that there's a healthy amount of introspection, which is ongoing, concerning our actual performance versus potential or desired performance. So as I alluded to in terms of the previous slide, this is an organic process. So it's a sequence of events, a process of evolution. So it's very difficult to define an end point. It will be subject to ongoing change. If we think or frame this in terms of TPR, so tier preparedness and response, for those of you that are familiar with that concept, it consists of 15 segments. So there's a section of which is displayed in the slide here, bottom right. Some of those are prefixed with an asterisk. Those are services that typically fall outside of OSRL's SLA, the service level agreement. So there are efforts afoot to enhance OSRL's contribution to these segments. I'll just reiterate that, of course, that will not be at the expense of our core services. So it's key that, albeit we can add value here, we acknowledge that that is feasible. So there's always scope for improvement. This must be achieved without compromising our raison d'etre. Augmenting existing services to optimise contributions by third parties. So this includes some of those segments that I've highlighted previously. So community engagement and waste management services. Clearly, there is scope to add value whilst we're in field. So this is often, or there's a consensus this will be achieved in collaboration with those third-party operators in field, and if we can better refine what we're doing in field so it's conducted in a systematic fashion and in line with best practices mentioned by both Richard and Adriana a little earlier, it becomes more transferable so that it can be utilised by third parties so they can operate remotely. And we can act as proxies in field on their behalf, ergo enhancing the service provided to our members for little additional effort or cost. For more information rather than the TPR will, there's an abundance of information on the IPECA website. There is a link in the bottom of this slide if you care to explore it further. Marcus, next slide, please. Opportunities. Open with reference to bilateral processes. So again, we're keenly aware of the fact that it is not for us to impose ourselves upon others. There is a time and a place, naturally, where we have to take the initiative. However, we're in a privileged position whereby we are owned by our members, most of whom, if not all, are operating in the oil and gas industry. So there's opportunity there for first-hand experience, and that works both ways. We often find ourselves acting as a conduit between our members, and it allows us to disseminate lessons learned on their behalf and in an effort to mitigate against any repetition of mistakes and sharing lessons learned. Again, it resonates with the message of best practice. It's also important, naturally, that we combine internal and external resources to maximise capability. This might take the form of formal arrangements, which includes the GRN, which is the Global Response Network. This is a collaboration of a group of 8 companies from around the world, one of which is OSRL, that all specialise in oil spill response. Secondly, there are the less formal arrangements. So there's opportunity for working with other OSPROs, and this is often the case, quite often on an ad hoc basis, but more often than not in the form of an exercise in preparation for a spill. Inevitably, in the event of a large spill, you'd have more than the one OSRO in attendance. So it's important that people understand or are willing to work with one another, and that's been borne out on many occasions. Less frequent over the last 18 months, so on account of the pandemic, but that will surely revert back to norms in due course. Working in remote regions with limited resources, close working with specialists in our member organisations. It goes without saying that our members also possess masses of expertise, and they're right at the coalface, so they're learning through doing. So that open communication is critical. There's also tier 1 responders in the field. Again, being a tier 3 responder, we're often at some distance, situated some distance from some of those tier 1 responders. When we arrive in the field, we have to be adaptable and willing to work with those responders. And it's a two-way arrangement in so much as we learn a great deal from those and exposure to their ways of working. Inversely, there's always opportunity for us to pass on practical advice and advocate for good practice. Clearly, there are some nuances that depending upon which parts of the world we find ourselves in. It's fascinating whilst working in remote locations. Invariably, you come up against some novel execution of well-established concepts. where we're striving for continual improvement. Oftentimes we'll have individuals bring them back and brief the operations, and oftentimes they're incorporated as part of our practices, certainly as part of that arsenal, which renders us more flexible in the event of a spill. You'll all know or recognise that necessity is the mother of invention. So those people in remote locations operating in the absence of resources tend to find a way of making things work. Next slide, please, Marcus. So I'm going to close out on a reference to some of the threats. Just to clarify, when I refer to threats, I'm talking in terms of it being important that we remain alert to new threats. Case in point being the pandemic. Clearly that had an impact upon our ability to respond. So it's important that we were well placed to provide ongoing support to our members, and the same is true of other OSROs, and that was again borne out over the last 12 months or so across numerous responses. Horizon scanning, all a bit highfalutin, but it makes sense in terms of looking for future risk. So preemptive, preempting change, making sure that we are established and comfortable in responding as best we can. Naturally, there will always be elements of reactive response that will not change despite best endeavours. And anticipating new risks, so understanding what the future holds and trying to appreciate or have a garner appreciation for what risks that might represent. So changing priorities, case in point, another reasonable example would be transition to renewables. Clearly, it's a step change in industry, but it doesn't eliminate risk. It simply changes the character of the risk profile. So again, we have to ensure that we move with the times. Preparedness work, environmental sensitivity mapping, and the identification of unique receptors. Tom spoke about this in terms of inland and potentially a greater level of scrutiny, just by virtue of proximity. There's likely to be more eyes on a spill. It's a lot harder to marshal that airspace when you're working inland. You've also the sensitivity of natural resources where you have direct consumption without prior treatment. So there are all sorts of implications there that, albeit they are clearly represent receptors offshore, some of the pressures and the expectations may be slightly or subtly different inland. So again, it's key that we don't grow complacent. We can't define our receptors and sit back and assume that we have established the metrics to which we work. We have to appreciate that things change, CSR, expectations, and certainly the pressures that our members are up against will change on a regular basis. So we need to ensure that what we do and how we prepare is commensurate to that changing risk. And maintaining relevant competencies. It's all very well saying the right things, but we need to ensure that our responders, our staff, are prepared to flex to the members' needs. So in doing so, we need to maintain an agile workforce that can perform multiple roles. And this is often the case. We'll find ourselves in a command centre and then being delegated elsewhere, whether that be on the shoreline or in an aircraft. And that will continue to be the case. So it's maintaining those skill sets, maintaining currency, which has proven challenging during the last 12 months or so, certainly in terms of group work or team working. That is the end of the section on preparedness. Marcus, I shall hand back to you for questions.
Thanks, Nick.
Thank you.
Like as Nick has said, that's brought us to the end of it's a little bit of a whirlwind of presentations, as it were, and it's sort of like a slight overview of what we've observed as a group. But I think, like I say, if there's any questions, we have got one or two that have popped in. But if you have got any, please put them into the chat function, and we'll work through them. But if I publish, so I don't know who the group wants to pick this one up. Possibly Richard. Do you consider produced water spills to be part of the oil spill regime? If so, should OSROs take the additional responsibility to prepare for this type of spill?
Thanks, Marcus. I would suggest it depends on the level of contaminant that still might be within that water, and what the intention of that water is to be from the industry that produced it. Should that fall under the responsibility of an OSRO, or should an OSRO be asked to take on that additional responsibility? Again, it depends on how much contaminant would be left within that produced water. The setting of its storage, the environmental sensitivities around there, It's a tough question that I think deserves some more thought, more reading about, and it deserves a better answer than I can actually offer you right now. I hope that helps. We can take that question forward, and whoever sent that question in, if you leave your details with either Mandy or Marcus, we can give you a more detailed answer at a later date, if that's okay.
I think, Richard, from my perspective, certainly from the offshore side of things in UKCS, we've responded to produced water spills, whether that's mobilisation of a surveillance aircraft or whether it's satellite imagery. In terms of physical intervention, like Richard has said, there's not so much that can be done because generally the volumes of hydrocarbon are quite low. In the inland environment, I haven't come across that, not to my experience, but I would still say it's probably part of the OSRO's responsibility. Or they should be prepared to respond to spills of that nature. But in terms of what is achievable in terms of intervention, then that may be up for debate. But happy for anyone else to chip in if they want.
I'd be inclined to agree. I think it goes without saying that there are a number of physical or engineered interventions which would serve to mitigate against the spill of produced water. As to what the impact is in terms of SEMA and trying to quantify impact, or what constitutes a proportionate response, I just echo what Richard has said. You need to characterise the produced water in the first instance to understand whether it was reasonable or what constituted reasonable in terms of response. But absolutely, I think whether or not it's the OSRO's responsibility, I think it goes without saying the OSRO would be more than willing to engage if they were mobilised in such circumstances. And I'm sure there are legislative requirements or limitations that, again, Rich would be better placed to respond to, and perhaps can do so in writing at a later date.
Thanks, Nick. We've got a question here. Will you be more visible in the Caribbean in the near future, since we are more involved in exploration and extraction? That is in terms of inland response, I presume. I think when you say more, well, first of all, I'll offer it open to the group. Adriana, do you want to pick that up? Consider it's in your patch, or do you want me to take it?
Yeah, I think we are working a lot now in Latin America in general, and we have seen a lot of operation in the Caribbean. So yeah, we're having more presence in Latin America in general. So yeah, the answer is yes. We're going to be more visible there.
I think saying the other thing to point out there, Adriana, is we've got the base in Fort Lauderdale. There is, and historically that was CCA, Clean Caribbean America. So there's quite a focus there. We've got some good engagement and some contacts there. But of course, we're here to better serve our members. So if that's the focus of their activity, then we'll certainly be there. It's a good question. Another question here. Is there much difference among a team responding to a land spill or responding offshore? I don't know, Tom, you're in response. I don't know if you want to pick that one up.
Yeah, perfect, said Marcus. I think there is obviously, well, within OSRL, all the responders are trained to the same level. So as when you join, everyone's got that experience or the knowledge of how to respond in each type of environment. Often, so for the UK spill that I mentioned earlier, as well as the one in the Caribbean, I personally attended both of those, and as well as the one in the Middle East, they tend to select people who are of the experience. So obviously we've got the core group, so there is this group of people who have that in-depth experience and knowledge, but generally the teams can be similar, with just one or two who have a little bit more of an interest or experience within inland.
Yeah, I think you're right there, Tom. Like I say, we train all of our staff across this broad brush, so everybody receives the same training. Some of the experience you develop and grow is obviously opportunity driven, depending on what instance you get to respond to. But certainly we look to tap in and make the most of the knowledge and experience that sits within this group. So is there a difference? I think in general, no. You know, the team that's on call is a team that's on call, but there are resources and expertise that can be called upon if needed. So, like I say, and the guys here have been used. I think Nick won't mind me saying that he was one that was out in the Middle East most recently. So it's you know, we draw on the resource as and where we need. There's a great question here. I'm going to ask you to answer this one, Nick. How clean is clean? Pretty much is what we're saying. When do we stop? How do you decide when OSR actions should be stopped and post-spill environmental monitoring and restoration activities launched? Are you happy to pick that one, Nick?
Sure, I shall. Yeah, it's a good question, age-old question. It doesn't. Oftentimes, there's not a satisfactory answer. The one constant is trying to establish a consensus. And that is remarkably difficult, as you'll appreciate, in any context. But here, it's probably best to come at it from by SCAT. So SCAT talks quite extensively about defining endpoints. It is a case of trying to define the endpoint as early as possible. It's oftentimes very difficult to justify an endpoint when you're midway through or indeed approaching what you deem to be the conclusion of that initial response. As far as the transition from reactive to proactive, so that reactive or emergency response to project management phase is concerned, that is often a conversation with the member. Certainly, as far as OSRL are concerned, that may be different for other OSRLs where they have different business structures. But as I touched upon in the presentation on partnerships, it's a case of acknowledging what is and not within your brief. Once you reach that point, it's a case of having a candid conversation and ensuring that you set the ground for the project management, whether that be groundwater remediation specialist or other. It's not always as simple as that. There will never be a clear-cut line, and quite often we'll leave someone in field to act as that point of contact or liaison between the member and the third party, just to ensure that data is readily available and is interpreted according to the works that have been commissioned. So in answer to your question, it's subject to many different opinions, whether that be regulator, third parties, and when we talk of inland, it's a gross oversimplification. Of course, it depends whereabouts we are inland, the nature of the environment, the reliance of local populations on the impacted resources. So I'm sorry to prevaricate to an extent, but in answer to your question, I guess in short, there is no one answer. It will depend upon the environment in which we find ourselves, but invariably it's not a unilateral decision. It must be a consensus as best you can achieve.
Yeah, I think that's why it's a great question. I mean, it doesn't apply just to inland, it could be shoreline as well, but yeah, it's a contentious issue. It depends, like I say, on where you are, the scenarios. A little bit feeds into Richard's legislation, you know, if there are endpoints that are pre-designed. So, yeah, great question. Got another one. So I think this one possibly for maybe Adriana. Any advice on how to operationalize the tactical response plans and embed it into emergency response arrangements?
How to operationalize the tactical response plan and embed it into the emergency response arrangements. Okay, so what we do, so originally we do an all-spill contingency plan that gives you the details on how to respond to, or the general instructions of how to respond to the emergency or to the spill. And then we do tactical plans that are very specific to the site, and it's an addition of the all-spill contingency plan. So for these tactical plans, we use sensitivity maps, we use the information from the area and the modeling results, and we build these tactical response plans to embed it into the oil spill contingency plans. I don't know if I answered the question.
Yeah, I think you have, Adrian. Just to follow up, or just to add a little bit, I think the way to really operationalize them is to go and practice them and test them. You know, making sure that the resources that you have are the right resources, or they're adequate, that response times are reasonable, that, you know, the people are trained, to get the people familiar with what they're going to be asked to do. So like Adriana said, they generally contain a lot more detail, but it's also something that, you know, once you've practiced it, you might, you know, those, if the detail isn't there or if there are gaps, then it become more apparent. So I would say it's, you know, it's practicing and drilling and making sure that that those issues don't become a problem. There was one other comment that we've just put out there. It was with regards to the produced water. Just to go back, it was obviously the salt content, the high salinity, that was is more of a problem as well. Again, for us, there's probably not much that we could do in terms of that. Is it an OSRO's responsibility? It sounds quite a specific issue. I'm not sure whereabouts in the world we're talking about, but if it's the salt, the high salinity of the produced water, then there's obviously sensitive environmental receptors that obviously don't react well to that. So a little bit more difficult for us as an organisation to answer that, to respond in that. If it's the oil content, then obviously there's more that we can do, again, albeit limited. But no, just thank you for pointing that one out.
Marcus, in regards that, I see, I mean, after the emergency response of the produced water spill, I think this is more a problem of a remediation project after that. So there is not much that we can do after the produced water spill besides the initial actions, but after that is more a remediation project.
Okay, yeah. Thanks, Adriana. I think that's pretty much us up on time, apart from a minute or two. I can't see any new questions. There is one thing I'll publish finally from Mark, or again, just going back a little bit on the legislation and that in the UK, that you can read in the comments, comment box. So if there aren't any more questions, I just want to leave it another couple of seconds, but we'd like to thank you for your time this afternoon, for listening to us. Mandy, but the recording will be sent as a link to the attendees, is that right?
It will be sent to everyone who registered, but it's also available in our technical library on our website. So if you want to check back there, but it should be within the next couple of days.
Excellent. There's one more question. I think this will be the last one. So we've got, how common is it for OSRAL to participate in multi-agency exercises with Category 1 responders where the scenario involves an inland spill, not a marine spill? I suspect this is rare and is possibly something for local resilience partnerships forums to think about going forward. Great question. Who wants to volunteer? I don't know. I was imagine either Nick or Richard or possibly Tom is better placed to answer that.
Speaking from personal experience, so a good question and absolutely something that we should be engaging in, and every intention to do so. So in terms of my short tenure at OSRAL, there have been 2 attempts to strike up exercises with the local resilience forum, and we've been met with positive reaction. However, you'll appreciate the last 18 months they've been busy elsewhere, but they have recognised that there is value, and certainly something we'll be doing in the near future.
Thanks, Nick. 2 more questions quickly popped in. Okay, so quick one. Are you aware, or the attendees aware, of a new API guide, Swift Water Response?
Yes, thank you very much. That was just this morning, in actual fact. It was circulated across ops by our colleagues in Aberdeen, as it happens.
There we go, it's a quick one. And another question is a little bit practical, but how do you evacuate recovered crude oil in a faster way in an area where there's poor access, no roads? Again, great question. I think this probably comes back to what Nick was saying when we start talking about improvisation and those kinds of things. There are ways. It just depends. I mean, expensive, but you can helicopter. You know, you can airlift it out. There are other options. Again, I'm not sure if there's no roads, but is there navigable waterways that it could be loaded onto small vessels or barges that can come out that way? It may be that you have to look in situ for whether it could be. I'm not sure you've got their recovered crude oil, if that is liquid waste that you're talking about, or whether it is heavily contaminated soils or sediments, but whether you could actually start looking at remediation in situ, something like that, or ex situ, should I say, that once it's been recovered, you can treat and then return it. So I don't know. Any other group have they come across any novel ideas?
Yeah, you can procure portable pipeline systems as well, where you can pump the crude quite a distance from location to a new extraction point, where it's possible to get more vehicular access. Plus, there's another way which is quite contentious, which is in situ burning, but that's specifically down to the country that you're in and what their policy is on in situ burning.
Yeah, that's a good point, Rich. That reminded me of the Amorgos spill in Taiwan, where recovered oil was pumped relatively short distances, you know, a kilometre and a half, couple of kilometres, but to an area where it could be temporarily stored and then removed by vac truck. So, yeah, another good point. So
I think they're right in saying, I'm right in saying, rather, Marcus, that at this time last year, Norilsk, Siberia, they did the same.
Yep, that's yeah. Again, another. Time's not a friend of mine, but yeah, I forgot. Yeah, Norilsk was another one as well. Again, not that we were involved, but yeah.
And at the other end of the spectrum, we've used donkeys to quite modest with respect to volumes, but effective nevertheless.
Okay, I think that's us up on time, Mandy.
That's it. Yeah. Thank you to everyone for all your questions, and thanks for joining us today. And again, this recording will be available if you'd like to share with colleagues, and check our website, the events page, for more webinars and seminars from our core group teams.
Thank you, everyone.